I've wanted to try 3D carving Kumiko for a while now, and I think an art piece would be a great project for that. But I wanted to try something a little bit more complex and make that art piece into a piece of furniture. I'm starting by making the Kumiko panel first. I normally make Kumiko with 1/2 inch by 1/8 inch strips, but for this project I'm using 1 inch by 1/4 inch. This led to developing an upgrade kit for my Kumiko sled. Although I didn't use it to make this project because it wasn't ready at the time, I do have a video out now explaining how to use the sled and an upgrade kit to make different types of Kumiko grids. I made the decision a while ago to always glue my Kumiko panels. I had the opportunity to spend a couple of days learning from a Kumiko master in Japan, Yoshihara-san. He has been making Kumiko for well over 60 years, and I learned a lot of techniques from him. One thing that he told me was, yes, most Kumiko patterns don't require glue, but over the course of decades, wood does slightly shrink, and because Kumiko has such tight tolerances, pieces can start falling out. So to make sure that his work stays together for centuries, he always takes the time to glue each individual piece in place, and I've adopted that into my work as well. Once the grid was assembled and all the glue had enough time to dry, I trimmed off the excess to turn it into a hexagon. The infill pattern is up next, and I want to do something pretty simple and not too visually complicated that it distracts from the 3D carved element of this project. So I'm doing the Asanoha pattern, which I've done multiple times before, and is the most common pattern within Kumiko. Some of you might know that I sell Kumiko jigs specifically to make the process of cutting these infill pieces much simpler. I'm using an extremely large size of wood to make this pattern, and because of that, the pieces don't fit in my jigs. So I made these new jigs, and I'm using a plane to cut the angles on these small pieces. Yoshihara-san gifted me this plane specifically to make Kumiko in this way, and it's become one of my most treasured tools. If you want to learn how to make Kumiko with more reasonably sized pieces, I sell various Kumiko starter kits and tools to help you learn that process. All of those will be linked in the description if you're interested. With all of these pieces cut, I took the time to glue each individual piece in place specifically for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But also, once the carving happens, there's going to be a lot of force applied in a bunch of different directions to all of these pieces. So I'm using a lot of extra glue specifically to make sure that everything stays in place once the 3D carving happens. I miscalculated and didn't cut enough pieces, so I'll cut more and fill these empty spaces in off camera. But for now, I want to turn my attention towards the frame. I found this beautiful piece of babinga that was at the bottom of my lumber rack, and I completely forgot I even had it. I'll be using it to make a segmented frame to hold the Kumiko panel. I want to make the frame out of 12 pieces so that it complements the hexagonal pattern of the Kumiko. And after using an online calculator, I knew the exact angles and lengths that these pieces needed to be. You may have noticed at the start of this video that the finished table doesn't have any babinga in it, and I'll get to that in a bit. After cutting and laying out all the pieces, I had a small gap, which I expected because I've only done something like this once before a few years ago, but I do have a way to fix it. I'm gluing these pieces together, but not as a full ring, and I'm doing it in 2 separate halves. Adding blue tape helps to hold the pieces together and prevents slipping when they're clamped together. I'm placing dowels between the two parts and using ratchet straps to clamp the pieces together. Once the glue dried, I secured the two parts down so that their ends are touching, and I'm using a straight edge piece of plywood as a fence for my circular saw, essentially using it as a track saw. The blade is cutting right between the two halves, taking a little bit of material off of both pieces. After the first cut, I slid one piece over to close the gap, but there was still a little bit of a space there, so I secured it back down and did the process again. After the second cut, the gap completely disappeared, and now I can glue the two halves together. There was a bit of inconsistencies in height between all the pieces, so I'm using a surfacing bit with my CNC to flatten both faces. I'll be using the CNC to cut all the profiles in this frame, and I want to cut the inside and outside of this frame accurately, so I don't want to move the frame and have to reset my 0 point. With that thought in mind, I placed bolts inside the T-tracks within the frame and secured them down. I'll be cutting the inside profiles first, so I'm holding the frame with clamps on the outside. The bolts on the inside will come in handy so that I can apply the clamps when I cut the outside profiles without having to move the frame in relation to the CNC. When I made the file for this operation, I set my 0 point to the center of the circle, so I'm temporarily adhering the scrap piece to the rough center. And then I'm measuring in from all the corners to get the exact center of this shape. That way I can use that point to set my X and Y 0, but for the Z 0 I'm using a touch plate on the actual frame since the frame is slightly thinner than the scrap piece. The first operation cut the inner circle and a lip for the Kumiko panel to sit into. Then I repositioned all the clamps, and before cutting out the outside profile, I want to reinforce all of these joints with splines. So I cut out pockets over every single joint. Once that was done, I then cut out the perimeter. For the splines themselves, I'm cutting them on the table saw, and I'm using a roundover bit to get the correct radius on the corners. These pieces are pretty small, and this can be a little bit of a dangerous operation, so I'm taking very light passes at a time, and everything turned out perfectly. I glued and clamped them in place, and once the glue dried, I used a Japanese pull saw to cut off the excess material. At this point, the frame is done, so it's time to move back to the Kumiko and do the 3D carving. And I don't want to take any chances with this because so much work has gone into it already. So I'm using both blue tape and CA glue as the double-sided tape method and clamps to hold this piece in place. I'm first flattening the panel with a surfacing bit, and I'm taking very conservative cuts. You can barely see any material actually being removed here. I'm sure everything would have been fine if I took deeper passes, but I didn't want to take any chances, especially because this bit is very dull and I'm due for a new one. So I ran this operation a few times until both faces were completely flat. Next up is the 3D carving, and I really don't know how well this would turn out. I've never used a CNC to do a 3D carve before, and I've also never seen it done on Kumiko, so this is a first in more than one way. This clip is sped up quite a bit, but I'm using a 1/4 inch flat end mill to do all the rough material removal. With the rough pass completed, I switched to a ball nose bit to finish it up. For anyone curious, this is the Onefinity Elite Foreman. It has a 48 by 48 inch cutting area, and Onefinity did send me this machine, but they didn't ask for much in return. And all of my opinions on the CNC are genuine. I do have another hobbyist level CNC that I was using before this, and this is a huge step up from that. This Onefinity is far more robust and can move much quicker and more accurately than my previous machine. And if Onefinity didn't send me this, I would be more than happy to pay the full price because it is more than worth it. If I were to do this again, which I definitely will be making more 3D carved Kumiko, I would just go the blue tape and CA glue route and not use any clamps. It was more than strong enough to hold everything in place perfectly. With the Kumiko cut into its final shape, I can now test to see how well it fits within the frame. And right here is where I realized that Bubinga is not the right choice. It's too bold of a color and takes away the attention from the Kumiko, which should be the main focus of this table. So I remade the frame in the exact same way, but out of maple. I think this is a much better choice, but let me know what you think down in the comments of which one I should have gone with. Up until this point, I didn't know how I wanted to attach the legs to the rest of this table. I had a few different ideas, and I ended up settling on this one, which is just a couple of pockets cut within the frame, and the legs will nest into them. In hindsight, it would have been better to cut out these sections when I was cutting the rest of the perimeter of the frame, but I didn't know at the time, and this ended up actually working perfectly. I used the same round over bit as earlier to soften the top and bottom edges of this frame. I want the rest of this table to be very simple for the same reason I swapped out the Bubinga to not distract from the Kumiko. So I'm using 2-inch maple dowels for the legs. These dowels are exactly 36 inches long, and I want this table to be 18 inches tall. So I have to cut them exactly in half, and luckily I nailed it on the first try. I made this jig to drill through the exact center of the dowels. There is a V-groove that will nest over the dowel, and a hole right at the point of that groove that goes through the entire jig. I can line up the end of the jig with the top of the leg and use that hole as a guide for my drill bit so that I can drill straight. I drilled as far as I can and then removed the jig and drilled the rest of the way through. I'm raising the frame with 1/4 inch spacers because I want the tops of the legs to extend past the top of the frame. Then I can transfer the hole locations from the legs to the frame accurately, using the legs kind of as a drill guide at this point. I then enlarge the hole to its appropriate size using a piece of blue tape as a flag so that I don't drill too deep. And then I screwed in a threaded insert. I added a roundover to the tops and bottoms of the legs, which completes all the shaping for this project. I then sanded the frame, legs, and Kumiko before adding finish. Because I'm using a lighter colored wood for this project, I didn't want it to yellow over time, so I'm using a water-based finish for the frame and legs. The Kumiko is a bit more difficult to finish and traditionally is left unfinished, but because this table is for sale and I'm not sure where it will end up, I want to add a little bit of protection, so I'm using a spray-on clear coat. I made these small clips to attach the Kumiko to the frame, and I wanted the Kumiko to be removable just in case it needed any service in the future, so I attached these with screws. The very last thing to do is to attach the legs, and for that I'm using these nice decorative brass bolts. Now I can put a piece of glass on top, and this table is finished. I am absolutely thrilled with how this table turned out. I was initially unsure how well the 3D carving and the Kumiko would play together because there's a lot of pieces coming in a bunch of different directions, but this looks absolutely amazing. This table is available for sale and it's linked in the description if you're interested. Remember to also check out the tools and Kumiko starter kits if you want to learn how to make Kumiko. Thanks for watching.